Hello and welcome back to Preventing Prevent Cambridge, our campaign as students of Cambridge University against the government's repressive and ineffective counter-extremism programme. We focus on prevent not as an isolated policy, but as something that is significant for 4 main reasons. Firstly, it's ineffective, with only 1 in 10 prevent referrals being correct according to the programme's own criteria, not even counting the thousands of prevent-related interventions that don't make it into the official statistics. Prevent isn't at all good at stopping violence, which we all want to do. Secondly, Prevent discriminates against British Muslims and often stigmatizes them, damaging social cohesion. Thirdly, the policy represents an overreach of state power into civil society, doing away with the presumption of innocence and operating in what's now called the pre-criminal space. If it's not challenged, this model of securitization will only become more pervasive in every area of our lives. And finally, Prevent threatens religious freedom specifically as part of the government's so-called muscular liberal agenda. The value of religious liberty is worth speaking up for. This series of interviews is intended to explore not only Prevent, but these issues that it's a symptom of and has contributed to. This episode, I'm honoured to be joined by Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad. He is the founder and dean of the Cambridge Muslim College and is a Sheikh Zayed Lecturer of Islamic Studies in the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge University and Director of Studies in Theology at Wolfson College. The Sheikh is the founder of the eco-friendly Cambridge Central Mosque, and his publications include Bombing Without Moonlight, The Origins of Suicidal Terrorism, which in 2007 was awarded the King Abdullah I Prize for Islamic Thought, and Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe, published last year. Shaykh Abdul Hakim, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
In Bombing Without Moonlight, you argue that the terrorism characteristic of groups like Al-Qaeda borrows its spiritual as well as its material armament from Western modernity, and as such is alien to traditional Islam, being instead a distinctly modern problem. Do you think that this is now understood by policymakers in Britain or not? And what are some of the ways in which an understanding or misunderstanding of the Islamic tradition has shaped counterterrorism policy?
Well, the discourse that identifies what it pleases us to call Islamist terrorism as a epiphenomenon of and a consequence of, rather than a reaction against the Enlightenment, is something that is quite widely accepted amongst sort of philosophers, thinkers, cultural historians, and so forth. John Gray has a whole book on what it means, Al-Qaeda, and what it means to be modern, which came out shortly after 9/11. Slavoj Žižek has frequently written about this. Many who are on the historic left, Ian Buruma, people like that, would see the methods, the agenda, the worldview, the ideology of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth, as bearing more of a resemblance to some of the illiberal, absolutist, totalitarian ideologies of the European 20th century than with any kind of recognizable Islamic root. And the fact that the principal targets of those movements are invariably traditional Muslims is one further confirmation of that. But unfortunately, politicians don't always listen to philosophers and cultural historians. They are always short-termists. They're on the electoral cycle. They're looking for a button that solves an issue that has a particular price tag. And the reflection that actually this outrageous phenomenon is part of modernity, rather than the comforting thought that it is simply the recrudescence of some Neanderthal, foreign, brown-skinned other that somehow has returned from the history books to torment us, is not one that finds wide appeal, and certainly is not one that is going to fly particularly with electorates who necessarily are looking for simple black and white solutions. So yeah, I think there's a radical disconnect between what cultural historians, theologians, and philosophers understand to be the nature of the current. It's not a clash of civilizations, a clash of extremisms, perhaps, on the one hand, and what the policymakers understand the situation to be on the other. And it's not easy to see how we theorists can actually be more clearly heard and actually make a practical impact.
The Prevent policy discriminates against Muslims in the sense that innocent Muslims are disproportionately affected by it. The Cambridge Student Union, for example, found recently that 60% of Muslim students at Cambridge say they self-censor to avoid becoming objects of suspicion. We might see Prevent then as one example of Islamophobia in Britain. But in your book, you propose using an alternative term to Islamophobia, lahab. So what does this term lahabism mean, and how does it help us to think about animosity towards Muslims and anti-Muslim discrimination?
Well, this coinage is my attempt to try and shift the discourse about this unmistakable but contested phenomenon of anti-Muslim chauvinism and prejudice into a lexical register that Muslims themselves will more widely recognize. In other words, Lahabism is my coinage taken from the name of Abu Lahab, who was one of the plutocrats of 7th century Mecca who persecuted and killed the Prophet's companions, a kind of prototypical example of establishment rage and fury against monotheistic dissent. But in fact, the term Islamophobia is not necessarily one that I'm allergic to. In fact, it was invented by a Muslim, a European Muslim. Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, before the First World War, was using this in some of his early theological writing. So it does have an indigenous lineage, if you like, a genealogy. But I think that the danger with the term is that because of this Greek suffix, it tends to invite a facile and possibly misleading comparison with other phobias that are currently being combated or vindicated. It's a kind of intersectional term, and I'm not sure that it should be seen as cognate with the other phobias that are currently denounced in society. I think it's different because it's ultimately about opposition to an alleged truth rather than opposition to a lifestyle, a race, or something like that. So I am proposing this term. I have no idea whether it will catch on or not. Probably not.
Very interesting, thank you. A central point that you make in your book, Traveling Home, is that European Muslims face a very particular challenge in formulating indigenized expressions of Islam, both because local European cultures themselves are often in constant flux, but also because Europe has historically defined itself as being that which isn't Muslim and as a sort of barrier against a Muslim incursion. So I wonder if you could go into this idea a bit.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the recent attempts to analogize the Islamophobia phenomena to other hatreds and xenophobias. For instance, Jim Wolfrey's rather helpful book about the situation in France, Republic of Islamophobia, he identifies this shift to anti-Muslim discourse as being the consequence of the decline of traditional political identities. François Hollande was the last recognizably left-wing politician in France, but he enacted so many sort of anti-poor measures that he had to face the sort of precursors of the Gilets jaunes movement. Macron is not really of the traditional right. Mélenchon, for instance, is in this very ambiguous situation of championing a kind of almost communistic anti-racist discourse, but at the same time, he's very much in favor of legal punishments against Muslim women who in schools or government institutions choose an Islamic form of dress. So it's the collapse of the traditional left-right polemic, which we saw at the time of Brexit, of course. The Brexit voters were preponderantly from traditional Labour voters. So we now have the phenomenon of the red wall. So the breakdown of those political identities, I think, is opening the way to those who wish to capitalize on older, real or imagined deep identities, which are not really about economy, but are about the identity of the nation. And Europe historically constituted itself, as you say, as being that small bit of the Roman Empire that never became Islamic. Although bits of it did, of course. Spain, Sicily, the Balkans, southern Russia, wherever you went from medieval Europe, if you traveled, you would sooner or later encounter Muslims. So Europe as a continent really is best defined as being the bit of classical antiquity that didn't go over to Islam. And so you have these enormously powerful myths that constitute the identity and the national sense of self of so many European peoples. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Madrid and visited the Church of the Spanish Armed Forces. And it's a relatively recent institution. I think in the 70s or 80s was when it was consecrated for that purpose. So the sensibilities denoted by the interior are relatively modern. But of course, in pride of place, there is the big shrine to Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Muslim killer. Matamoros, the title of the patron saint of Spain, means the Muslim killer. And there he is with his suspiciously white face, looking serene on his horse, trampling a black-faced Moor underfoot. And those images of Matamoros, kill the Muslims, are all over, not just the Spanish world, but the Hispanic world as well. The biggest pilgrimage route in Europe is the Camino de Santiago, which leads to the Cathedral Church of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. And it ends at the great image, the great shrine to St. James the Muslim killer. And there he is again with decapitated, turbaned, dark-skinned heads of Spain's enemies underfoot. And there he is with an amazingly white face, looking serene. So that's the Spanish story. Spain emerged as the result of 900 years of Inquisition, ethnic cleansing against, of course, not just Muslims, but Jews as well. The whole story of the Inquisition emerges from that. And then when you go further east in Europe, you have very recently, just a generation ago, the excruciating hatreds that generated the genocide in Bosnia, which looked like the Inquisition in many ways, and the absolute implication of church leaders in that. I have a whole chapter in the book about that. A very shocking story. And then further east, you get, say, the lost Muslim lands, which are now part of Russia, Circassia. The biggest single genocide of the European 19th century was the murder of 90% of the Circassian people, a great European nation. So complete a Holocaust that when Boris Johnson came to power, people said, oh, isn't it interesting? His great-grandfather was a Circassian who had memorized the Quran. But of course, the journalists and the chattering classes didn't even know what a Circassian was. They're dead. Europe dealt with them in this ethnic cleansing way. So yeah, the fringes, Europe's margins are bloody margins. Europe has bloody edges. And invariably, they're constituted by the struggle against a Muslim presence and the possibility of conviviality in those margins. And of course, the other Semitic other, the Semite within, as it were, is the Jewish community. So Europe constitutes its external borders in terms of its furious inquisitorial crusading against Muslim populations, but its internal borders against the other Semites, the Jews, with their rejection of the messianic moment, etc., etc. And many scholars have pointed to the very close thematic convergence between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, which is another very important thing to understand. The Inquisition saw itself in many ways as a conflict against Semitism, and they would actually use that category, the idea of the Jews and the Muslims as being aspects of the same thing. Monotheistic, with dietary laws, with circumcision, with particular dress codes for women, etc., etc. The resemblances are real. So that convergence, I think, also feeds into certain constructions of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia. It's not anti-Semitism generally not acceptable on the mainstream European right any longer. They learned the hard way after the Holocaust, but many of its key tropes, they won't integrate. They live in ghettos. They have their own laws, so they can't be loyal. Circumcision, dietary laws, etc., etc. Many of those tropes have simply been imported into the new discourse against the Muslim presence. It's a kind of vicarious anti-Semitism, which may well, one might speculate, account for its stubbornness, its unreason, and its apparent ubiquity.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. So you've spoken about the populist convulsions that have appeared across Europe, and especially in the past decade. Yeah. And of course, a lot of these have been motivated by concerns about increased Muslim immigration and Muslim communities. What's interesting is that the populists haven't really come up with a winning strategy because they're struggling to win elections or to maintain consistent popular support, as we've seen in Germany just now. But their significance seems to be in how they've transformed the political environment in many countries, even through defeat. So in France, Marine Le Pen won't necessarily win next year's election, but her very presence on the political stage has caused the centrist government to introduce increasingly coercive anti-Muslim legislation. My question then is, do you think that the salience of questions of immigration and of the Muslim presence in Europe is likely to increase in years to come or not? And how might this affect the political situation for European Muslims?
Well, it will increase, even though the landscape is more complex. And even the kind of phenomenon of the prevent referral is starting to reflect this, because the percentage of referrals for far right suspected offences continues to creep upwards. That may, in the longer term, damage the straightforward equation of Islam with violence, when sort of white Christian identity movements also are identified with acts of terror. The incel movement, all of the recent terrorist events in Canada, for instance, were the work not of Muslims, but of incels. We've had a couple of incel attacks, fatal attacks in the UK in the last couple of years, a Satanist attack, and so forth. So I think that we're looking at a more complex situation. It's not just the nice white European self being threatened by the evil brown immigrant Muslim other. It's a much more complex situation. It's not a two-way polarity. However, the Muslim presence is not going to go away and will increase in statistical significance. And this is one reason why the likes of Douglas Murray, for instance, hyperventilate about the need to restrict Muslim immigration, because Europeans are not reproducing, but these Muslims are. And therefore, there's a kind of fundamental anxiety here about survival, about sexuality, about manhood, which is a very, very visceral and primordial fear, which also ties into the old anti-Semitic tropes, because the alleged Jewish fertility rates were one of the key tropes that mobilized anti-Semitism in the early 20th century. So again, we see that parallel in what may be an ominous and prophetic way. So yeah, the average Christian or post-Christian woman in Europe has about 1.8 children, which is way below the replacement rate. But the average Muslim woman in Europe has 2.9, which is not an outrageously huge number. 2.9 kids is, I've got more than that. But still, it's a healthy rate. And as a result, the arithmetic indicates that the Muslim population is likely to increase. Now, we haven't crunched this year's census data yet, so we don't really know the latest realities in Britain, but between 2001 and 2011 in the UK, the official statistics pretty clearly indicate that the Muslim population grew in size by 60%. That's pretty significant. And in Eastern European countries, they just say, well, we're not going to have them at all. They just put up razor wires and have explicitly religiously specific immigration policies, and they keep their countries with an aging white population in the hope that that's a long-term solution. In Estonia recently, the European Union said that the Estonian quota for Syrian refugees would be 25 people. And the huge demonstrations all over Tallinn and Estonia, because they didn't want these Arabs in their nice white sort of aging Christian Eastern European country. It's not quite that visceral and crazy in Western Europe, although in France it is, as you say, getting pretty bad. And traditional French Republican xenophobia and anti-clericalism is certainly stirring there in quite anxious ways. I mean, when you think about Sarkozy, who made a lot of very pungent and nasty remarks about Arabs and Muslims, how was he defeated for the nomination of his party finally? Because an outsider came in, this guy called François Fillon, who had just done the electorally smart thing. He'd published a book called Defeating Islamic Totalitarianism. Nothing really about labor laws in France and the things that really matter, but an anti-Muslim book meant that Sarkozy was ousted and somebody else took his place. Politicians are getting increasingly see that this is a fast track to success and will construct false, illusory Douglas Murray type images of the Muslim threat simply because it's such an exciting story. However, the basic demographic issue needs to be addressed. We're absorbing the Afghans now. There will be other waves. There will be climate change refugees, particularly from the Muslim world, because the Muslim world, for geographical reasons, is particularly vulnerable to climate change. And that can only increase, it seems, over coming years and decades. So it means that everybody in Europe, Muslims included, have to get a grip on themselves and recognize that this is a volatile situation. We know what Europe is capable of because 20th century history is, we're constantly reminded of it. Europe is dangerous, but there are certain possibilities here. And it's essential for everybody not to lose their cool and not to go down the rabbit hole of all Muslims are fundamentalists or all Westerners are evil Islamophobes. I think a more humane and reasoned capacity to overcome gut reactions is urgently required if this is not to become a vicious spiral, self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think something like Prevent, by officially stigmatizing, actually or implicitly, the Muslim community is not on the side of the angels here. It definitely makes Muslims feel that they are scrutinized by the beetling brows of a Whitehall officialdom, that even school teachers might well be spying on them, that they really have to self-censor. And we all do it, and I do it. Many people now are cautious. No, if you've lived in Saudi Arabia, as I have, you're used to not being able to say certain things. So you transplant that to the British context, and it kind of is, you just automatically do it. It becomes second nature. But it's certainly not the traditional Lockean conception of freedom of speech, state neutrality, the right of dissent, and so forth. That seems to be lost sight of as vote-seeking politicians constantly push the anti-Muslim button in order to reassure anxious and often putatively xenophobic electorates. So Prevent, I think, will not go away anytime soon. If it does, it'll be replaced by something else that is grounded in the same kind of religious illiteracy, which will do far more probably to radicalize unhappy young Muslims than it will do to resolve the problem. You don't make people good by smacking them, but that seems to be the approach that many European governments are taking nowadays. Something more humane based on listening, I think, is urgently required.
Thank you very much for that. I want to now look at the very related question of religious liberty, because the Prevent agenda has seen the government define extremism in terms of opposition to British values, which are essentially liberal values. And that's part of what the government calls muscular liberalism. And this has led to Ofsted inspectors questioning young Muslims in schools on their religious beliefs and their adherence to liberal principles. There have been instances where Muslim schoolgirls have been interrogated about why they wear the headscarf and Islamic inheritance laws and how they feel about them. And in 2018, the head of Ofsted actually defended one school's decision to ban the headscarf. So with Prevent, we're seeing the argument being used that Muslim children have to be protected from this by the state from the religious values of their parents. Now, as you've just alluded to, Britain has historically had a form of secularism which allows for religion having a far more significant role in the public sphere than what France has had. But the problem is that Britain is increasingly irreligious and continuing to secularize. And so today, both the liberal left and the conservative establishment, I think, are too often unconcerned about religious freedom. So do you think that this new and coercive brand of liberalism in Britain poses a significant long-term problem for religionists in general, not just Muslims?
Not just religionists, I think. It can be seen as a kind of spin-off of the larger shift towards coercive liberalism, one of whose aspects is the so-called woke agenda. If you look at current controversies at the Labour Party conference in Brighton, for instance, is everybody with a cervix a woman or not? That seems to be a very divisive issue. And Mr. Starmer says, oh, it's not right to say that everybody with a cervix is a woman. He's anxious about speech. He's anxious about committing a speech violation, as we say nowadays. He might be outside the opinion corridor, as we say nowadays. The issue that really tore apart the Scottish National Party last year was precisely this polemic between the trans activists, or many of them, and the traditional feminists, or many of them, over whether gender can be possibly a matter of self-identification. And very many people, even if they are a million miles from religion, are self-centering a lot. A lot of academics are doing this, certainly. New and apparently draconian definitions of anti-Semitism being imposed in and by universities may well, and I think does, chill free debate about Israel, Zionism, and so forth. So this is just one aspect of ways in which liberalism is, it seems, reinventing itself, not as, in the Lockean and the Humean sense, state neutrality and the vigorous defense of people to live and speak as they wish, as long as it's not immediately and catastrophically criminal and vile. And that being replaced by a new type of liberalism, which is not the defense of an empty space, but rather the conviction that certain things are intrinsically true, that there are truths, social beliefs about what is true, about gender identity, about sexual identity, about racial identity, etc., etc. And that these truths are so self-evident that they have to be the state's truths, that we have for the first time in really, well, certainly many decades in the UK, a state ideology. The state believes something rather than just allows you to believe and express yourself. And this perhaps was inevitable when you consider that culture abhors a vacuum. Sooner or later, this idea that the state doesn't have an ideology is going to be replaced by the state subscribing to a creed of some kind. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the idea of these body beliefs, ideas about the body, but also I think ideas about the unworthiness, the problematic status of traditional religionists, not just Muslims, but conservative Catholics worried about abortion, Orthodox Jews with a particular style of life, is reflecting a mode which the state is now adopting, which seeks to compel people to accept certain beliefs, which converts them to certain beliefs. And if they refuse to convert, then it will take over the education of their young children so that the families sooner or later are forced to convert. It's quite similar to the approach that you find in more totalitarian regimes. It's certainly the position of the Soviet Union. Even if you can't prevent people from believing in Jesus, Stalin thought, at least you can take over the education of their children so that they don't believe in that kind of thing. So what we're seeing is a shift towards, again, a very Western tradition of totalitarian and authoritarian promotion of state truths at the expense of the private truths of individual citizens. Where this will lead, whether there will be a traditional liberal reaction against this new coercive liberalism, it's too early to say. At the moment, things are not looking too positive.
Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, thank you very much for doing this interview. I personally found it extremely fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone at home for watching, and we'll see you next time.